Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I'm Matthew Lucas, and we post a video every Friday. So do hit subscribe if you want to follow our continuing adventures so that you too can become a horticulturalist like Stephen.
And do remember that we do shorts every Monday, which are answering the questions of our viewers. So if you would like to ask us a question that I can deal with in 60 seconds, put it in the comments section below.
And include where you're from, because it helps Stephen contextualize his brilliant answer.
Well, exactly. I need to know where you live.
Now, where are we?
Well, we're in the Royal Botanic Gardens, Melbourne.
Nestling beneath this fabulous
Bird's nest fern.
I was trying to think of the name. Asplenium.
Yes, Asplenium.
So I remembered.
Yes. We are in the Fern Gully in the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. And today we're going to look at plants that should become readily available in commerce, but for some reason or another don't seem to have, at least here in Australia. Some of them might end up being common in other parts, but certainly here they're not.
They've slipped through the cracks. So actually it's not bird's nest fern because it's quite easy to get, but there are some wonderful things in the garden. So we're going to take a tour around, and Stephen is going to stop us in our tracks and tell us all about these rare and wonderful things and why they should be grown more. So without further ado, Stephen, let's go and find the first plant.
What a good idea.
Stephen. Well, this should be in cultivation. Oh my goodness.
Yes, Gardenia thunbergia. Stunningly beautiful shrub.
If only you could smell it. Imagine a gardenia and dial it up by 100.
Yeah.
Goodness me.
It is, it's fabulous. But there are good reasons why this plant is rarely available commercially here in Victoria.
Oh no.
Yes, unfortunately.
What?
Well, one, it has to be raised from seed. It can take 10 to 15 years to flower. And when it's a young plant, when it's sort of about yay big, it is this stiff, twiggy thing with curly, miserable looking leaves. It always looks half starved and thirsty.
So it happens, Stephen, I've got one in a pot, which is just fitting that description. And I'm now wondering, oh my goodness, will I be alive should it ever bloom?
It will give you something to live for.
Okay.
So the reasons that you don't see it round is it's slow to get up to a decent saleable plant. It never presents well as a young plant in a pot. And of course, it takes a long time to flower. So all those things are going to play against a plant like this to find its way into general commercial cultivation. Damn it.
But, you know, like all things, it's like having a child. Your children take 18 years to mature.
Sometimes they take a lot longer than that. But
You know, I'm on the edge myself. But this is stunning. So how old do you reckon this specimen is?
This plant has to be anywhere between 60 and 80 years old. And it's what, 3.5 to 4 meters tall and a bit wider.
Yeah.
And it's just growing in one of the borders here at the Botanic Gardens. And it is quite literally laden in flowers.
Oh my goodness. So let's just, it says here it's from Africa.
Yeah.
That's a very broad descriptive. Where particularly is it from?
All right. Well, it's not particularly cold hardy. I can't grow it at Macedon. Our frosts are a little bit too much for it. I have tried a couple of times. I tried when I was young, actually, thinking I would have something I could watch when I get older. But now it's all too late. All too late.
Tears of age,
Yeah,
Stephen.
that's right.
You don't have this to
No, I don't have
comfort
this.
your old age.
Well, anyhow, it is what it is. I can come and visit it in the Botanic Gardens in my wheelchair, perhaps. It certainly won't cope with more than a degree or two of frost. So it would need a much more tropical style climate to grow really well.
Or temperate. We're Melbourne is considered sometimes a warm temperate or a wet Mediterranean. So we, in the city centre, almost never get to 0 centigrade, 32 Fahrenheit. We certainly never get frosts in the city centre. Further out you can. I just want to, you mentioned raising it from seed. We'll come and show you the seed pods.
It's got
they
pods.
look like kiwi fruits.
Yeah, I wouldn't try eating them if I were you, though. But yes, they're quite large, woody type seed pods. You know, you can wait 10, 15 or longer years to actually get flowers. So I guess that means that's how long you wait for your next crop of seed as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to watch this space for mine in a pot. Can other gardenias be struck from cuttings? This one can't.
No, this one doesn't seem to strike from cuttings. I'd love to hear from somebody who can prove me wrong, but commercially the only way you see it grown is from seed. Certainly some of the other gardenias are quite easy to propagate from cuttings, so hence they've made it out into the trade more. And some of the smaller ones like Gardenia radicans, I mean, makes a fabulous pot plant in a nice warm sheltered site, flowers very young. I mean, it's got all the attributes you need for a good commercial plant. Unfortunately, this one, which I think is far more stunning and beautiful, doesn't have the commercial plant potential.
And the flowers are huge. They're almost the size of my hand.
They're wonderful.
On to the next.
All right. Behind us here we have a shrub of far from prepossessing.
I was about to say, you took the words out of my mouth, not that prepossessing,
Yeah,
Stephen.
no, it's not. But it is a plant that probably should come into cultivation more, and as much as anything for its story. But let's talk about what it does first.
Yeah.
So this is Sophora Toramiro.
Yeah.
Its native name on Rapa Nui or Easter Island was in fact Toramiro, so it's been taken from the native language. It was sacred to the Rapa Nuians, and they used the wood from it to carve their sacred totems.
Oh.
Unfortunately, they got a little overzealous and got rid of most of it. Now, the story goes, and I'd love to know whether this can be confirmed or not, but I don't actually care because I think it's a fabulous story.
Yes.
The very last plant of its type was growing on a cliff face in Rapa Nui.
Yeah.
And when Thor Heyerdahl did his Kontiki expedition across the Pacific on a raft to prove that Polynesians could have moved right across the Pacific,
Yeah.
he landed in Rapa Nui and he collected seed from the very last known plant of this, and the seed went back to Sweden. Now, how did it end up in Melbourne? Nobody actually knows, but when they were doing a reassessment of the collections here at some stage, they keyed this out and suddenly realised that they had Sophora Toramiro. So we don't quite know how it found its way into the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, but those of you who know the New Zealand cowfie tree, which is Sophora tetaptera, it's the floral emblem of New Zealand.
Yeah.
It has a yellow tubular looking flower or bell-like flower. It's actually in the legume family, so it's in the same family with your peas and beans. And this also has yellow flowers on it. Now, when it's in bloom, it's very pretty. It's a small to medium shrub in cultivation, it would seem. So it would fit into an average garden. It's growing in a spot here where it's under the canopy of large trees, but gets plenty of sideways light. And it's performing perfectly well in the gardens here in Melbourne. I think its hardiness rating is quite good. I've seen it growing in the Botanic Gardens in Chile and doing quite well there, and that's in sort of northern Chile. I've had it at Mount Macedon. Unfortunately, I lost mine in the millennial drought, but I've got some young seedlings coming along, so hopefully I've got a replacement for my garden. And it will probably never ever hit commercial horticulture anywhere in the world, except that it's got such an interesting story. I mean, if they were to adapt that story and use it as part of the sales pitch, like they did with the Woolamai pine, when that was first discovered in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, you know, suddenly this dinosaur tree, and, you know, they put it in pots with fossil implants on the sides and all sorts of things and played on the story, and then it became something everybody wanted.
It's called marketing, Steve.
It is called marketing.
Now, so to that end though, is it easy to propagate or germinate?
Well, I've grown it a couple of times from seed and it seems to germinate quite well. Like a lot of the hard-seeded leguminous plants, I soak it in hot water overnight and sow the next day if the seeds have expanded, because that means it's taken in water, and so those seedlings should germinate. And I normally hold on to my seed and do it in the early spring. So that's what I would do with growing Sophora Toramiro.
Wow, what an amazing story. It doesn't look much now, but I take your word for it.
It's very pretty in flower, albeit even then it probably isn't one of those plants that's going to grab people and drag them in. But when they know the story, it then suddenly has much more behind it that makes it a really interesting plant.
All right, let's see what else we can find that should be in more common cultivation.
Yes, exactly. All right, Matthew, what do you think of this as a foliage plant?
I do love it, and you have actually sneakily told me the name, and the minute you did, of course,
Yes.
the leaves did seem familiar.
Yes.
Tell the viewers.
It's an Aucuba. So it's not your classical
Public toilets.
public toilet spotty laurel. That,
Which I love.
yeah, I have no objection to it either, I have
No.
to say. This is one of the Chinese species. This is labelled in the Botanic Gardens here as Acuba chinensis, but I am informed this plant is Acuba chlorescens, because chinensis has smooth leaves. This one has quite indented veins in the leaves, and it was first came into Western cultivation only a few decades ago, imported by Roy Lancaster into England.
All
So
right.
it's still rarish.
We won't tell the gardens you think it's got the wrong name.
No, well, they'll find out for themselves if any of them watch it.
Very handsome shrub. So does it have the same kind of care as the other Acubas?
Likes the shade,
Yeah.
fairly drought tolerant,
Yeah.
quite cold hardy,
Yeah.
would make a good tub specimen, a good indoor plant even. And although it can grow to a large plant, this one's easily 4 meters or more tall. It's prunable, so you could keep it in a comparatively large pot for a long time. And I think it is a wonderful, underutilized, probably due to just not being known here much. I mean, it's been in Europe for longer than it's been in Australia, but it will take time for people to find out about this plant and sort of start using it, because I think it will be a fantastic plant.
It's very handsome, and also really beautiful, shiny textured leaves. And in the shade, it looks gorgeous, because shady spots are often difficult to get texture and
they can be. And I think this Acuba will fit a lot of bills in a lot of different countries once people get to know about it. And of course, those of you out there like Matthew that are not generally enamored to variegations, you have got here a plant that in fact isn't so, it's not going to offend anybody with delicate sensibilities.
Like me.
Yes.
Now, the Acuba that we've spoken about in your garden needs a boy and a girl. What's the sex life of this plant, Stephen?
Exactly the same. And as far as I know, in this country, we're not quite sure whether we've got a boy or a girl. I don't know whether it's been imported more than once, so it may well have just been imported as a plant once, and therefore all are propagated from cuttings from that, so they'll all be the same sex. But I haven't seen it in flower yet. This one is more than big enough to bloom, but there's no sign of any obvious flowers forming in it.
No.
So it might be a little ways off before we work out whether we've actually got a boy or a girl. And then we won't know whether it will cross-pollinate with the other species.
Oh,
so that's always possible. You could end up with some hybrid swarms, which could be fun. Well, this plant is Acuba chlorescens, sometimes being sold around and obviously labelled here as chinensis, but that is a different beast.
Okay. What's this fabulous salvia?
It isn't.
Aha!
So there you go. It's sometimes called giant salvia, so people see the salvia look-alike thing going on, but in fact it's not even in the same plant family. So this plant, Brillantaisia, is in the same family as your acanthus, so it's in the Acanthaceae family.
Really? That I would not have picked.
Yeah, well, there you go. Now, it's a southern African plant, comes from tropical zones. I can't grow it at home. It's just too cold sensitive. It's borderline hardy here in Melbourne. I'm assuming if you were going to grow Brillantaisia to its best, then a slightly warmer climate, sort of Sydney and north, would work quite well. And in fact, in some of the more tropical areas, it could become somewhat weedy. I've seen it gone feral on Mauritius, growing along stream beds and so forth.
But where's it from?
Africa.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so not far away from its home, but not quite its home. And it's a sort of soft-watered shrubby plant, and it flowers for months in the late summer, right through the autumn, until the cold weather sets in and puts it to sleep.
So I guess, given that it's tropical and that it's marginal in a country, in a climate like ours, it's actually great as a perennial here, because it's never going to run away with itself. Whereas if you were in the tropics, it could. It is a plant that could be in cultivation more in temperate zones, where it's not going to go mad, but isn't going to get knocked down by frost, so you're not too cold. So Melbourne is kind of perfect. Yeah,
it should be good for our sort of commercial growers here, apart from the fact that it would grow quite nicely here without getting out of hand. The other thing about it is it's remarkably easy and quick to propagate from cuttings, and you should be able to get it up into a 20 centimetre pot in full bloom, all in the one season, and you could push it out there through the chains and the barns and so forth, and possibly make a fortune if somebody got onto that plant.
There you go. Unfortunately, we're in the Botanic Gardens and I shan't be taking a cutting.
No, but I do know somebody who's got some who I'm sure will propagate it for you.
Excellent. Other note, flowers are beautiful, covered with bees.
Yes, it's a great bee-attractant plant. And I might add, we didn't mention the foliage, but the leaves are handsome, slightly spearhead-shaped with a broad sort of stipule coming back along the leaf.
Yes. Really gorgeous. And is it herbaceous?
It's sub-shrubby. So it probably needs to be, it probably needs to be cut down anyway in the winter, probably late winter before it starts to shoot again, to bring it up as fresh material from the ground. Otherwise, you're going to end up with sort of a lot of dead stuff hanging around.
On to the next. This, Stephen, looks like a marijuana plant.
I wouldn't smoke it if I were you.
That's in general cultivation a lot, Stephen.
Yes, of course it is. This, though, is in the same family as English ivy and a lot of plants in that group, the Aucuba. and it's a thing called Metapanax delavayi.
Yeah.
It's one of 2 species in the genus. They both come from China, and of course was named after Delavayi, who was a very well-known plant collector way back.
Okay.
And this plant is so underused. The only reason I can think of is that it's its own worst enemy, because people just don't know about it, so nobody asks for it, so the propagators don't do it. It's not that hard to propagate.
So this is an interesting sub-question about why these things aren't more commonly available. So we've got it's very slow growing to flower with the Gardenia. We've got difficult to propagate.
Yeah, that can happen.
We have now got something that is just not well known.
Yeah.
Maybe this is the moment.
Yes, well, let's hope it becomes far better known. It is being grown quite a bit in England and North America. Very rarely available here. It shows up occasionally in a few nurseries, but very rarely. It's a reasonably solid grower. It makes a good tub specimen. It's shade tolerant. It's comparatively drought tolerant. Don't put it out in full sun though, it will be inclined to bleach.
So, just to contextualize, it's actually in quite a lot of shade. It's under the canopy of a lot of mature trees.
Yes, it's got big evergreen trees above it and big deciduous trees nearby. So this would hardly get any direct summer sun. And it never has a downtime. It's always clean, neat and attractive looking. So although the flowers are small, greeny white numbers,
they are covered in bees, by the way.
Yeah.
The pollinators are loving it.
Yeah, well, anything in the ivy family does tend to be quite an attractant of pollinators. Yes, you have a good English ivy in full flower and it will be buzzing with bees. So there you go. So, but even though the flowers are greenish, they're a completely different shade of green to the foliage, so they stand out quite well.
And they're very structural.
Yes, the whole plant exudes quality, I think. So it's well worth growing. The problem is finding one. It can grow up to about 3 to 4 meters if it's left alone. Of course, most of these things in this family are very prunable, so you could prune it back to keep it within bounds. And of course, growing it in a big tub, it's not likely to grow as big as it might in the ground.
Yeah. So propagation-wise?
Well, I've struck it several times from semi-hardwood cuttings in the summer. Seems to strike reasonably easily. May not be for the complete novice, but anybody who's a reasonably competent propagator shouldn't have any problems growing Metapanax.
Wow. Well, fantastic. Well, let's hope its fame is spread and it's more common in cultivation.
I would love to see it around a bit more. Although, having said that, as the plant snob that everybody knows I am, I don't want to see it in every garden.
Available.
Yeah, because then I'll get bored with it. So
here is the man that does have Acapanthus in his garden. Now, in Britain, that's a wonderful Mediterranean plant bed. In Australia, they are literally weeds now because they've gone feral. But you have Acapanthus.
I use plants that are useful sometimes.
Not a complete snob.
No, not a complete snob. If it does the job I want and it's common, I might plant it. But if I can get something that does the job I want and it's not common, I'm likely to err towards that one.
So maybe we shouldn't be making this film because you're actually...
Yes, I'm promoting plants that might
plants.
actually become common dross
and
one
that
day.
aren't that difficult to grow. Anyway, let's see what else is on your list.
All right, what a good idea. All right, Matthew, here's another plant that is not generally in cultivation in Australia.
Yeah.
I believe it's a little bit more commonly grown in Europe and possibly North America.
Yes.
It only came into Western cultivation in 1907. Ernest Wilson bought it out of China. There's only a few known sites of it in the wild, so it's quite rare in the wild. And it's a plant called Heptacodium miconioides. And in China, it's known as seven suns flower because the flowers normally sit in clusters of 7. So there you go. Now, it flowers in the late summer. When the flowers finish, the flowers drop out and the calyxes expand and become quite a pretty sort of deep pink, almost a corally pink.
Very
so
pretty.
That carries the show through. Its foliage in the autumn is all right. It goes a clearish yellow, which is quite nice.
Yeah.
And it also has a very nice sort of papery bark that peels off in sheets. And so that can be a feature of it when it's bare.
So I must say, it doesn't look dissimilar structurally to an established buddleia in terms of the bark and the form.
Well, it's actually in the honeysuckle family, though. So there you go. It's not related to a buddleia. But I think it's a plant that has some promise.
Now, it's a large shrub, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not really a tree. So whereabouts in China is it from?
Southern central parts of China. It's quite cold hardy.
I was going to say, so hardiness.
Yeah, hardiness rating, I'd say you could grow it in most Western countries without too much trouble.
Is it deciduous?
It's fully deciduous, goes yellow before it sheds and drops its leaves. It seems to be coping with some of our more torrid summers, although I don't think it's a completely drought-tolerant plant. Certainly growing very well for me in my nursery garden up at Mount Macedon, and this specimen in the garden here is doing quite well. I noticed it's got a little bit of leaf burn, so it may have copped a few hot days on it during the summer, but all in all, it seems to be quite healthy.
Well, let's hope that this baby comes into more common cultivation. It is glorious.
It's a very pretty plant and should be out there far more than it is.
There you go, on to the next. What else has caught your fancy, Stephen?
Well, if I said to you, what do you think this tree is, would you really know?
No. It looks vaguely familiar, but no.
Yeah, all right. Well, it's actually a maple.
Ah, that was not what I was thinking.
Yeah.
It looks, I don't know what it looks like.
Well, I would have said at a glance it almost has a bamboo-esque quality.
Bamboo-y, or one of those finer-leaved ficus.
Yes, something along that line.
Yeah.
Anyhow, this is Acer pentaphyllum, which comes from southern China. It's a weird plant because it's, yes, a maple.
Why, Stephen? Why?
But it's in its own section within the genus, so it's not closely related to any of the other maples. It is restricted in the wild to the extent that the last time I checked, there was supposed to be only a couple of hundred specimens in the wild of this particular tree.
Yeah.
It grows really well in the Melbourne climate, so it copes with our fairly hot summers.
Yeah.
It copes with our cool but not necessarily cold winters. And it's a moderate sized tree, so it grows big enough to make a good shade tree in the average suburban garden without getting too big. And the other thing I love about it is when it turns in the autumn, it goes soft yellows and apricot colours and sheds, but it doesn't re-come into leaf until mid to almost late spring. And some people might say, well, that's a disadvantage because my tree looks dead for longer.
Yeah.
But if you're growing woodland plants, and particularly woodland ephemerals like woodland bulbs and things underneath it, it gives those plants adequate time to feed themselves before it comes into leaf.
Yeah.
And it's also great from a passive solar direction as well, because you don't normally need, in this state anyway, you don't need that much shade in sort of October, early November. It's once you get well into November when the heat starts to come on, and that's when it's really good to have your trees in leaf. So
there you go. And there are the seeds, just to make it quite clear that it is a maple.
Yeah, so Acer pentaphyllum. And I love the fact that we can grow it well in Melbourne. It produces ample seed, so there's no reason why it couldn't become a more commonly grown tree. I guess its big problem is the fact that it doesn't look like what it is. So if somebody comes in asking for a maple and then you present them with this, they're going to say, but that doesn't look like my concept of a maple. So plants that fall outside of the obvious sphere of what you expect a genus to be sometimes get left behind.
Fall through the cracks.
Yeah, because they don't in fact look like what you're expecting. So
well, I think this deserves a place in everyone's garden.
it's a gorgeous tree.
Well, now we have the seed.
Not ripe.
Oh, Stephen, I've already asked Stephen how many of these things he's grown and got seeds, because I'm already running a shopping list.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping other people will as well, because I'd like to see some of these plants at least become tenuously connected in commercial horticulture, because it's a very good way to keep a lot of these plants going, particularly with the pressures we're under these days, with climate change, deforestation, all of the things that are going around the world. We can play a small part, perhaps, in keeping some of these plants going.
I'll try. Particularly that Rapa Nui plant, amazing. The maple, I'm going to try that as a tub specimen.
Oh, there you go.
What was the purple plant?
Oh, the Brillantaisia.
Brillantaisia. Oh my goodness, I am in love with that. It's just so dramatic and purple.
Well, I want to be invited to your place when yours is in flower, because I can't grow it.
Well, okay, watch this space. Well, thank you, the Royal Melbourne Botanic Gardens, for allowing us to wander through. It's just been a fantastic day.
It has indeed, and we will be doing more here, undoubtedly.
We will indeed. So hit subscribe if you want to watch what else we may have done here in the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And if you've got a question for Stephen,
please post it below and I will try and answer it.
And tell us where you're from. We'll see you next week.
Bye all.